Hello, boys and girls. Today I have decided to regale you with tales of my life as an Irish pirate radio DJ, and mightily bored you will be. My story begins in 1976 when I was about 12 or 13 years of age. Lying in the sun, it was a magnificent summer, those of you who will remember 1976. And as I lay on a lounger, I switched on my transistor radio and heard BBC Radio 1, the great sound of same, and names like Noel Edmonds and who else? David Hamilton, who's recently written a book, and Tony Blackburn, all suddenly came into my life. And they had a wonderful significance because the music was great. It was just on the cusp of disco at the time, so things like Donna Summer, I Feel Love were out. It was a marvellous time to just get in tune with suddenly what it is you felt you wanted to do with your life. And in my case, I always wanted to be a broadcaster. Life took me in a different direction, but I still love radio as a medium. And it started right there and then. Time moves on like it always does. Operating in the background had been the Radio Dublin, and this was in the late 60s. It was the brainchild of the now notorious Eamon Cook. I'm not going to go there. Go Google him if you don't know who I'm talking about. Captain Cook, Eamon Cook, Radio Dublin. All the salacious and nefarious details are there, and outrageous details indeed. They came on the scene around 70, well, certainly they started to be popular around 77, 78 for sure. There was no alternative to RTA an Seagadh, the national station. We were stuck with the likes of Liam de Valley and Larry Gogan, who still is around. Fair play, Larry. And many more. We had Byrne as well, who is world class, but certainly would be light years away from what the youth were looking for, and young people in general, which was pop music. So around 78 or so, when I was still at school, I remember Radio Dublin marches were being organised. These were to make aware or to plead to the government to give legislation to commercial stations. England had been through the same thing a decade or so before, and eventually that's how Radio 1 and the likes came on the scene. They had their own pirate thing going back then. So the first big pirate radio station was Radio Dublin. Yes, there were pirate stations in Cork and places like Waterford, but to my mind, Radio Dublin was where it was at, for one reason and one reason only. It had a captive audience. It was playing what the kids wanted to hear. And so for those 3 glorious years or so, they had no competition to speak of. I started in 1983 with Radio Dublin. I was 20 years of age at the time. Prior to that, there had been a schism within the station taking place sometime in the late 70s, whereby DJs and staff who had been with Radio Dublin had become suspicious of inappropriate behaviour, to say, and that's putting it mildly, in respect of Eamon Cook. A mutiny had occurred while he was on holidays in Spain, and if they didn't take his transmitters and smash them or commandeer them, they certainly trashed the place. And I remember stickers indeed being burnt and what have you, and they went off and they formed ARD. Today's story just concerns ARD and Radio Dublin. ARD stood for Alternative Radio Dublin. It was run by the likes of a gentleman who'll come to mind, Dr. Don, I think, certainly was there. It had residencies in places like Capel Street, certainly Crofton Airport Hotel. I distinctly remember that. They may have been on 257 on the medium wave band. Sorry, I'm getting a bit anaraki here, but this is largely what this message is addressed to today. It's only a very small amount of people are going to be interested in what I'm speaking about. They ended up in, they were at one point in North Frederick Street in Dublin, which is where I come in very briefly. My first shot at radio as such was a call that was made to me when I was at home one day. I had a schoolmate who was in ARD in Frederick Street at the time. I was very impressed by these guys. They had little leather ties and piano ties and sleeves all rolled up. It was very 80s. And I wanted in on it. I hadn't a clue how to go about it. Perhaps I was sending demos in to the likes of Eamon Cook, but I was going nowhere fast, and I really was just a wannabe boy broadcaster. At that point, I got a call one Sunday saying, "Will you fill in for so-and-so?" Wow, I thought my school buddy has put a good word in for me. I arrived up in ARD, which was located over Walton's Music Shop, just at the top of O'Connell Street in North Frederick Street. There was a DJ on air. It was my first time ever seeing the likes of a radio studio. It wasn't a proper one. It was a make-do one, but it was, you know, I was very starry-eyed about it. The DJ on air was a guy called Chris Barry. I'm not sure if he's the same one who went on to make his name in talk radio. I distinctly remember the pop shield was lemon coloured. I thought that was very trendy, but my nerves were up to 90 that day. I mean, I was really, really scared. And for those of us who are now comfortable in front of microphones, just cast your mind back to that first time when you think everybody's listening to you. And back then, there probably was a good amount of people listening to me. I went in and made, as we say in Ireland, a complete hames of it, right? Forgive the odd profanity, by the way. Fucking hames of it. My first record played on air was Rapture by Blondie, which is still a great track, I think. And we had twin decks set up. You'll see it sometimes, well, not really anymore. And what I was doing was, as I was playing, I was so nervous, as I was playing a record, I'd end up taking it off physically, take the needle off. It was just diabolical. I ended up doing a pathetic SOS call for my brother. Come in, Jerry, God rest him. Come in, Jerry, if you're listening, and just wonder if you'll give me a lift home. And oh, it was tragic. First and last time on ARD. They had enough, you know, when they heard me on air. As I said, you know, that was 1981 at the time. Sunshine, the first Super Pirate, were coming on air. More about that perhaps in part 2. I had an involvement with them as well. Radio Dublin, just for the record, inside Radio Dublin. Well, I started out on what was called Radio Dublin Channel 2, which was their answer to RTE. Eventually got their act together and formed 2FM, or Radio 2 as it was known then, coming at you. So Eamon Cook decided that he too, this is the way, by the way, folks, that he used to talk. He would open himself an FM station as well. So Channel 2 was born. It was briefly known as well, a lot of people won't know it, but as Horizon Weekend. I distinctly remember that. And when you walked into the studio, by the way, you get into radio by just hanging around and telling everybody coming out how great they are, how much you listen to the station, that you want to get in. A lot of them will ignore you, but if you persist often enough, back then there was no email, etc., you just kept showing up and kept hanging around. Unfortunately, for some children that hung around that gate, their life was to take a change. Life-changing events would happen. But for little wannabe bumfluff, mustachioed guys like myself, it was an entree into the world, loosely termed, in their case, of radio. Channel 2 had a microphone. I must I might put a picture up of it. A microphone stand coming out of the ceiling, and it came out of the ceiling right down, and there's a picture of me holding the mic, you know, but there was a hole, like, boom. This was, if you went in there and you were any kind of a handyman, you'd find yourself a million jobs to do, because it was a decrepit, close to semi-abandoned building located in Kilmainham, close to the historic Kilmainham jail, Kilmainham in Dublin 8 to be precise. And there were a couple of guys in there I got to know, and I started to get the swing of it. There was a little mixer board and a kind of a red console. I distinctly remember that console board. People like Ger Rowe, ex-Phantom, will know exactly what I'm talking about when it came to Channel 2. Within, I don't know how long, I'd managed to blag my way into the main station itself, Radio Dublin 253 on the medium wave band. it still had, at that point, 1983, most people had gravitated towards the more professional stations like Sunshine and Nova, but there was still a bedrock of listenership there, definitely. As I said earlier, anybody could come in and have a go, and many did, the likes of Dave Fanning certainly being one. A lot of people, as I said, cut their broadcasting teeth in Radio Dublin. It was supposed to have a ghost called Ermintrude. I just keep that in mind because I used to do graveyard shifts, wouldn't you know? So I'd keep an ear out for Ermintrude. Never saw anything worse than Eamon Cook himself, who, as I said, ran the place. It had a studio clock in Channel 1, or Radio Dublin itself, big studio clock, and it used to have this kind of hypnotic, you could switch it and it would go like Bakira's eyes from Jungle Book. It was probably to keep you awake, whatever. Twin deck set up as well as cassette decks, and you would take live callers on the air. I'm ashamed to say I have found recently some of these broadcasts of me doing live calls. They are pathetic in the extreme, but everyone's got to start somewhere. A lot of people would say, well, not a lot's changed in regards of myself. Fair enough, I can take it. But they were really, really bad. So you'd be talking to people at 2 a.m. in the morning or whatever. My main slot was at weekends from 8 to 10. There were people like Pat James doing the rock show. He's currently with the existing, the new Nova, if you like. Still around, Pat. He's still gigging, I believe. And a guy called, his name will come to me. There was a few. Adrian St. James, of course, is a current colleague of mine on Spirit Radio, and everyone knew that great name, Adrian St. James. Pat Gill was the chap I was trying to remember. He passed away recently, like a lot of people I'd be talking about, and he stuck in my head. A lot of people wouldn't remember him. I thought he was good. Here are my main stories about Radio Dublin. I am about to stop talking now. We'll go to part 2 at some point. Eamon Cook was a convicted paedophile. I said I'm not going to go there. There were kids in the background, little stray waifs of teenage girls. I say in the background because there was a room behind me, and there was a kind of miscreants as well, kind of people that had lost their way in life hanging around. Literally, there were holes in the floorboard. Anybody that was there will tell you this. You would take your life in your hands walking across. The only time I ever went into that room wasn't really to talk. It was manky, as filthy as was the rest of the building, but was to get my fan mail. We did have fan mail back then. And to collect whatever little packages people would send for me, little presents and panties and stuff. It was all very exciting when you're 20 years of age. But there were children in there who were loosely termed telephonists. They would pass on the requests to the DJs on little scrawly handwriting on bits of paper. So no doubt some of those came into his nefarious, abusive influence and were taken advantage of. As I said, that is another story. What I distinctly remember about him is he was a filthy, slimy, sleazy individual who had big ideas about himself and had, for certain people, a kind of a Pied Piper effect, because he was, whether you liked it or not, at one point the kind of main focus of pirate radio. He used to drive around in this battered white Jaguar with red sticky decals, homemade ones, saying Radio Dublin on them. The story I want to tell about him in respect of myself is as follows. I was on air one night, probably 1 a.m, 2 a.m. I can date this because it was 1984. Archbishop Byrne of Dublin had died, and around that time I had this kind of crazy little jingle because I fancied myself as a Kenny Everett. I know, but anyway. And the jingle was a piss take on the Pope's visit to Ireland, which had occurred in 79, where he had said, "Young people of Ireland, I love you." And I had, "Young people of Ireland, listen to Mark Manning. He's the best. He's number one." That's supposed to be a Polish accent. And Eamon had heard this in his filthy grief hole upstairs through the monitor. and he came down like a ton of bricks down the stairs and on top of me as well. A good friend of mine once said, Eamon doesn't wear a suit, he wears carpet. That was an apt description, because there was a mixture on his suit of foreign matter, God knows what bodily fluids, streaks of runny egg, dandruff, an ironed in piss stain on his trousers. He also had a big hole in the back of his trousers, a slash in the back of his trousers, if you like, and he would lean over the console in front of you to fix wires and things that go bump in the night, and he'd be there, and you'd have a gander if you wanted, if you were so inclined. I wasn't. He was a filthy individual who was probably in some ways, well, obviously deeply freaking freaky and disturbed. He came down and he berated me. How dare you play the likes of that, and Archbishop Bryan is barely cold on the slab, you cheeky little Johnny, jump up. But he started to let me have it, and I took so much of it. In retrospect, the hypocrisy. This is it. Not only the hypocrisy of the church in terms of child abuse. This guy suddenly became the moral high ground spokesperson for the church, and he was upstairs probably abusing children at that stage. So I like in life, I generally let people pour it on me to a point. And I may have only been 20 or 21 at the time, but at one point in the barrage, I just got up and I said, do you know something, Eamon? If you fucking are so interested in this station, you go and play the fucking records, because this kid's out of here. Or words to that effect. Probably worse words now that I think back. And he was left with the mouth open while I left Nino D'Angelo's Guardian Angel, a one-hit wonder, playing on the deck. And got a taxi or got into my car or whatever and left him to it. I had a further involvement with Radio Dublin, and I might begin the next half of my memoirs on that note, but then we'll segue very quickly into the serious stuff, which was the advent of Sunshine 101 and Nova, the likes of which had never been heard in Ireland before. Thanks for your time, and see you down the road.